Hi there, I'm Eitan, and welcome back to Wix Wiz. Today I want to talk a little bit about responsive design in Editor X. As you may or may not know, one of the big selling points of Editor X is that it is much better at responsive design than the classic Wix editor. And I really want to hop in and explore that and show different techniques that you can use to make your website more responsive because it takes a lot of skill to make your website responsive, even using a tool that is built for it, such as Editor X. And by no means will I touch on every aspect of responsiveness in Editor X, but I do hope to touch on the key points. So let's get started. So first of all, when we're dealing with responsive design in Editor X, the first thing we'll want to talk about is our breakpoints. And breakpoints are basically screen sizes for which the design of our website will fundamentally change. And you can see here on top, we have the three default breakpoints that you get when you create a new Editor X website. And the first one will be desktop, which is primary, and then tablet, which here is defined as 1,000 pixels and below. And if I click there, then you'll see that my canvas here adapts and becomes 1,000 pixels wide. And the last would be mobile. So this is already quite different than the classic editor where we only have two states, one for desktop and one for mobile. And these breakpoints can be adjusted, and you can also add additional breakpoints. But for most cases, these three key breakpoints will suffice because the responsiveness doesn't end with breakpoints. It also has to do with how you build the design on the page. And even within each breakpoint, there can be several screen sizes. And if you build your website correctly, then you can make your elements adjust even to subsets of these different breakpoints. So let's just demonstrate the use of breakpoints before we go any deeper. So I'm just going to add an element onto our screen. I'm actually going to add two elements. So let's just add a container. So we have a gray container over here, and let's change the color of this container. So to do any editing, we're going to go here on the right-hand side, and let's go over here to design, and I'm going to change this color to blue. And then I'm going to go ahead and I'm just going to copy this container over and put it here to the right of this container. And I'm going to change the color to pink. Okay, so now we're on desktop and the two containers are side by side. If I go over here to tablet, you can see the two containers are side by side. Their width adjusted slightly, and that has to do with something else that we're going to talk about later on. But let's say once I go down to tablet, I want the blue one to be on top of the pink one. Okay, so I'm going to go over here and I'm going to make sure that my section is large enough to accommodate these two blocks. Again, this is not necessarily how I would do it in a real case scenario. This is just a demonstration of how the breakpoints work on Wix. And then if I go down here to mobile, you can see that they are still one on top of the other. But if I go back to desktop, they'll be side by side. Okay, so this demonstrates an important part of breakpoints when you're designing them on Editor X, and that is that they always flow downwards. So any change that you make will affect all the breakpoints under it, but not the breakpoints above it. So if I make a change on tablet, that will affect mobile, but it won't affect desktop. Okay, and if I want to make a further change on mobile, and let's say I decide for some reason that mobile, I still want them side by side, even though I didn't want them like that on tablet. When I go back to tablet, they'll still be one on top of the other, mobile side by side, desktop side by side. Okay, but if I make a change over here and I put them one on top of the other in desktop, this should change it for all of the breakpoints going down. Mobile is still side by side, probably because I changed it specifically before. So you kind of have to get used to the different quirks of working with breakpoints in Editor X. But as a rule of thumb, you always want to work from top to bottom. So first, make sure that your design is how you want it on desktop, and then make your adjustments for tablet, and then for mobile, because if you optimize for mobile and then make a change on desktop, that can affect your mobile design, and that would be quite annoying. Okay, so that's a note about breakpoints in Editor X. But you'll notice here, I'm just going to move these side by side again, that except for the breakpoints, we have these gray handles here on the side, which can adjust the screen width even within a certain breakpoint. So you can see here that I'm making it smaller, but I'm still in desktop. And then once I crossed the 1,000 pixel threshold, I moved into tablet. And here, even within the tablet and within the mobile, there are different widths that I can view my website as. And playing around with these handles is a really important part of checking responsiveness in any website, but here in Editor X. And it really makes sure that our elements are responding to the change in screen size, which is basically what responsiveness is. Okay, that your website changes based on the device, based on the window size that's viewing it. And you can see here that as I'm moving these handles, our elements are getting wider and thinner. And that is because these containers have their width defined by the width of the entire screen. And in general, that is, as a rule of thumb, a good way to design your elements so that they are always adjusting based on the width of your screen. So in order to do that, you can go over here to the upper right side and take a look here at layout. Okay, so I can do a few things here. I can put the container here in the center of the screen. And you can see here that my width is defined as a percentage, and percentage will always be based off of the screen size. So if it's 31%, that's 31% of the width of my entire viewport, of my entire screen. And if I change this, for example, to 80, then you'll see that the container now takes up 80%. And when I change the size of my screen, you can see that the width changes along with it. But if I had changed this to, let's say, pixels, okay, so a fixed width, and then I go ahead and I try to change my screen size, you can see that my elements start getting cut off, okay? And that's because it is no longer responsive to the size of my viewport, to the size of my screen. Okay, so that's one important point over there. And as a rule of thumb, width should be something that is defined dynamically based on the width of the screen, as opposed to height, which can be something that either you set in advance or you allow the height to change automatically to accommodate the change in width. So let's take this, for example, this pink container, and we're going to place it. I'm going to go back to desktop, and you see here that the changes that I made, for example, in tablet are not affecting desktop anymore. So now my website looks kind of messed up, and I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to erase these, and I'm just going to add new containers so that all my breakpoints are nice and clean. So for example, I'm going to take I'm going to add a new element. So let's add a new container in here, and I'm going to change the color just so you can see it a little better. So let's go back and we'll make it a nice light blue, bluish purple. And let's change the width to 90. Okay, so on desktop, I want the width here to be 90, and that looks good on desktop. But for example, if I go down to mobile, okay, maybe I want it to take up the full width of the screen. Okay, so then I can change it here to 100%. And then inside of all the mobile, and just make sure that we're centered. So I'm going to go up here, and I'm going to make sure that we're centered on the desktop. Okay, so if I would have clicked center here within the mobile, then I would have had to go back to all the breakpoints and make sure it's centered. But if I jump back to desktop and I center it, then we'll be centered all the way down. Okay, so always remember that hierarchy between the breakpoints. Okay, and now you'll see that throughout the entire mobile, the width is 100, and then once I go up and past the to the tablet breakpoint, then we go back to 90%. Okay, so that's kind of how I would go ahead and design a container that I wanted to be different in different breakpoints. And let's show now how this would look if we had, for example, text inside of this container. Okay, because that's a very common situation. So I'm going to add some text in here. And let's go ahead and edit text. And I'm just going to add like some lorem ipsum garble here within the text, just so that it's kind of long and it takes up a lot of space. Okay, so I'm going to take this text and I'm going to make it larger. And you can see here that I'm kind of having trouble moving the text around. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go into my layers and I'm going to remove the text. Okay, I'm going to delete the element because I had added it here in tablet. And I'm going to go back to desktop and I'm going to add it within the container. Okay, so now that I pressed Control V while I had the container selected here in layers, means that I placed this text within the container. And for some reason, I still don't see it. It's not being displayed, and now it's being displayed. Okay, so now we see this text here, and I'm going to spread out this text like so. Okay, so now if we kind of adjust this like so, then you can see that our container is getting taller as our text gets thinner because it's accommodating our text, but it's also constrained by width. So the height changes accordingly, which in general is quite responsive design. And in terms of the text, I can also make it fit into this hierarchy by also telling it to be of width, let's say 90. Okay, so that could be one approach. Another approach is to approach the text from the container. So I can say that this container won't have a min height. It'll have a min height of none. Okay, so that it hugs our text completely. Okay, and I'll make the width of the text 100%. Okay, and make sure that it's centered. So now our text is completely filling our container. And if I want to adjust how the container wraps the text, then I'll do that with padding. Okay, so let's say I can add here padding and I'll change this to percentage and I'll lock it so that it's the same for each side. And let's say I add 3% of padding to our container. And now you see that we've kind of centered the text within the container using padding. Instead of defining it from the text upwards, we did it from the container downwards. And this in general is a principle that will just help us stay more organized for our website and just stay more responsive in general. And I think I did all of that within tablet, and that's why it didn't affect desktop again. So you see, really, if you're not focused, and this happens to me all the time, whether I'm designing my websites or I'm just making a video for you, it's very easy to forget, which breakpoint you're in and to make a change. And as you see, it's quite annoying. But yeah, so what I should have done here, instead of making all these changes in tablet, is to go up to desktop and make those changes there. But, you get the point. So that's another important part of responsive design. And one more thing I want to show you is using containers with several parts, okay, several rows or several columns. So for example, I can take this container over here and I can split it up into I can change the layout. Okay, so let's say I give this a layout with two rows, okay, and I copy this text and paste it again. And you can see here I'm doing everything in tablet because I already made the mistake of being in tablet, so I'm just continuing here, but ideally this would all be done in the desktop. And here you can control which of the grid cells your child elements are in. So I'm going to tell this one to be in the bottom. And here, what we have between these two elements is a gap. Okay, and we want to basically control the distance between these two pieces of text using the gap. But before we do that, I want to make sure that each of these grid cells is completely quote unquote hugging these text boxes, and there's no unnatural spaces in between. So in order to do that, you'll want to go to the container and take a look here at columns and rows. Okay, so you can see here that the rows, which is basically parallel to height here, are min max. Usually I will put these on min content. Okay, and that makes sure that they are hugging what's inside. You also have to make sure that you don't have any min height over here and that we don't have any margins such as this. So you see here we have like a margin top, so I'm going to put that at 0. And now you can see that both of these are being completely hugged. And if I want to put a space between them, I can do that using gap, which would be right here. And then I can give it, for example, a 10 pixel gap. And then I'm really controlling the distance between these two elements very precisely. And I could change that to, let's say, so if here we don't have the option of percentage, but we have here viewport height, okay, which is a more dynamic distance. Okay, or I can do this according to viewport width. Okay, so because let's say the larger our viewport width in general, it could be that I want a larger gap here as opposed to if our width is very small, then I'll want a smaller gap here. And let's see what that would look like. So let's say I give, this is 5, it's as if 5% of the viewport width, okay? The difference between that and percentage, there is a small difference, but from many perspectives, it's similar. One example of a difference is that because, let's say, these text boxes, because they're not directly children of the page, they're children of this container, their 100% is 100% the width of this container, whereas their the viewport width is still the full width of your window. I hope that was clear. Maybe not, but experiment and figure it out. Okay, so let's take a look at what this did for us. So like if I make this smaller now, then we should see the gap between the two getting a little smaller. And you can kind of see that that's happening, that the gap is changing slightly as I make this wider and thinner. Okay. One more way to control the relationship between elements, except for putting them inside a container, is by stacking them. So let's take a look at that. So I'm going to go back to desktop. I'm going to erase all this. And stacking, I'll usually always try to stack everything that I have in a section eventually. That way they just keep a nice relationship with each other. So if I, let's say, take a text element, and let's add some more, garble over here. Okay, so if I add a text element over here, and then I add another text element, and you can see here that this text element is anchored to the top, and this text element is anchored to the bottom, and this might cause some problems with us as we go down between viewport, because you can see here that now they're overlapping. Okay, inside of mobile, we have an overlap here. And that's something that we don't want to happen. And the way we can prevent that is by stacking them. So if I click on both of these elements, then I have the option here to stack. And this will basically keep a preserved distance between these two text elements. And if we go over here and we go to check out the margin for this top element, we can see it has 24 pixels margin on the bottom, and that margin is within the stack. So if I change this to 10, you can see that blue little area over there changes, and I can make sure that these are both centered within the stack, for example, or both aligned to the left within the stack, etc. And in a lot of ways, a stack is like a container, except for when it's not, and then you realize that you need a container, or vice versa. I don't really have any rules for when to use each. A stack is kind of just simpler, more straightforward. And let's just show you that we don't encounter the same problems. So when I go into mobile, you can see that these two are stacked nicely and they don't cross over anymore at any point because they're within a stack. Okay, so that's another very valuable tool for making sure that you have responsive design inside of Editor X. So just to recap what we talked about today, we talked about breakpoints. We talked about different screen sizes within the breakpoints and how to arrange elements by making them a percentage of the width of the screen or of their parent, how to use different layout settings such as paddings and margins in order to preserve the distance between elements and keep our elements responsive. We also talked about containers and stacks in order to make sure that we don't have any overlapping elements and that we preserve the distances between elements as we want them. I encourage you to go ahead and explore the different options here that we didn't talk about, and to explore the effects that using things like min content, max content, and stuff like that to make sure that your website is responsive on Editor X. If you like this video, don't forget to like and subscribe. And please leave any questions or things that I missed in the comments below, and maybe that will lead to a new updated video about responsive design in Editor X. So thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.